The move to the new apartment had been a whirlwind, packing, unpacking, adjusting to the unfamiliar edges of a new home. But there was something undeniably comforting about the forest nearby. It stretched out like a green sea, calm and inviting. From the kitchen window, I watched neighbors return from the woods, their baskets brimming with mushrooms. The sight stirred a childhood nostalgia I hadn't felt in years. Mushroom picking was a tradition where I grew up, and it suddenly seemed like the perfect way to ground myself in this unfamiliar place. "Come with me," I told my husband that morning. He shook his head, distracted by our baby who had just started to crawl. "You go ahead. It'll be nice to get some fresh air." It was decided. Armed with a small bucket and a pocket knife, I set off. The August sun was warm on my back as I crossed the field that led to the edge of the forest. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, and the hum of insects filled the air. The forest itself loomed like a gentle giant, its canopy thick with leaves that whispered in the wind. The moment I stepped inside, the world changed. The air turned cool, damp. The soft hum of the outside world faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I told myself it was peaceful, but there was something off. The kind of silence that feels heavy, as though the trees were watching. I brushed the thought away and focused on the ground, my eyes scanning for mushrooms. At first, I stuck to the main path, always keeping the open field within sight. But as I ventured deeper, the pull of the forest grew stronger. Every few steps, I told myself, just a little further. The main path became narrower, winding through thick undergrowth, and soon I couldn't see the field anymore. Still, I pressed on. The mushrooms had to be here somewhere. The deeper I went, the more the unease crept in. At first, it was subtle, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Then came the silence. It wasn't the natural quiet of the forest anymore. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. All I could hear was the crunch of twigs under my feet and the quickening of my own breath. I turned, hoping to catch a glimpse of the field or the road I had left behind. But there was nothing, just a wall of trees, their trunks impossibly close together. My heart sank. I tried retracing my steps, but the path I had been following was gone, swallowed by the undergrowth. "Okay, stay calm," I whispered to myself. "You're not lost. Just keep walking in the same direction, and you'll find your way out." But every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy so dense that barely any sunlight broke through. Shadows twisted and stretched across the ground, and the air grew colder, wetter, as though I were descending into some forgotten place. Then I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. A creak, like the groan of old wood under pressure. It came from somewhere up ahead, faint but distinct. Relief washed over me as I imagined another person in the forest, perhaps another mushroom picker. I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. But the creak came again, louder this time, and I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between the trees, just out of sight. I hurried toward it, desperate for the reassurance of another human presence. The creaking noise grew louder as I followed it, my steps quick and clumsy on the uneven forest floor. Then, suddenly, I found myself standing at the edge of a swamp. The ground beneath my feet was soft and spongy, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. Tall reeds swayed gently in the stagnant water, their tips brushing against one another like whispers. And in the middle of the swamp I saw it. At first, I thought it was a man, a tall, thin figure standing motionless among the reeds. But as I squinted, trying to make out more details, my stomach churned. Its skin was a sickly green, slick and reflective like algae. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, and its head was tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. The creaking sound came again, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from the creature itself. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my legs shaky and weak. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, heavy and unrelenting. My mouth went dry, but somehow I managed to speak. "I don't want anything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me go." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a sound I'll never forget, a laugh, low and wet, bubbling up from the depths of the swamp. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my arms and face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a labyrinth of shadows. I couldn't hear the creature behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that endless maze of trees. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with every step. All I could think about was escaping, getting out of the forest, back to the safety of home. Finally, I saw it, a break in the trees, a faint glimmer of sunlight. Hope surged in my chest as I stumbled toward it, tears streaming down my face. Within moments, I was back on the road, the familiar sight of the field stretching out before me. I collapsed onto the ground, my hands trembling as I clutched at the dirt. When I turned back to look at the forest, it was different. The dense, menacing thicket I had just escaped was gone, replaced by the familiar outline of trees that seemed almost welcoming in the daylight. It was as if the forest had swallowed its secrets the moment I left. I staggered home, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had I seen in the swamp? Why had the forest felt so alive? I told myself it didn't matter. I was safe now, and I would never set foot in that forest again. For weeks, I avoided even looking at the forest. I closed the curtains in the kitchen, refusing to let its presence invade my home. But the forest wasn't done with me. It started small, a faint smell of damp earth that seemed to cling to me, no matter how many times I showered. Then there were the dreams. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sound of that creaking laugh echoing in my ears. In the dream, I was always standing at the edge of the swamp, staring at the creature as it beckoned me forward. But the worst came one evening, as I was putting my child to bed. I leaned down to kiss him goodnight, and as I straightened up, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. A shadow, tall and thin, with arms that hung too long and a head tilted in that same, unnatural way. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the forest, silent and still. But I knew deep down that it was watching me, waiting. And from that moment on, I knew one thing for certain: I would never step foot in the forest again. The first signs of something being wrong came a week after that night. I started noticing small things at first, things I could easily dismiss as coincidence. The damp smell of the forest followed me everywhere, even into rooms where the windows hadn't been opened for days. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long as the sun went down, twisting along the walls like black tendrils reaching out for me. But it was the whispers that made me question my sanity. Late at night, as the apartment fell silent and my family slept, I began to hear faint murmurs. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the window. But the longer I listened, the clearer the whispers became. They were not random. They were words. "Come back." The voice was raspy, low, and somehow familiar. I recognized it as the sound I'd heard in the swamp, the wet, bubbling laugh of the thing I'd seen there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head. But the voice followed me everywhere. It lingered in the silence of my kitchen, in the stillness of my bedroom, even in the hum of the city outside. One night I snapped. "Leave me alone." I screamed into the darkness, startling my husband awake. He stared at me, wide-eyed, as I stood in the middle of the room, trembling and breathless. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. I wanted to tell him everything. But how could I explain what I didn't understand? How could I tell him that something from the forest had followed me home? "I'm just tired," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of something far worse. The forest became an obsession. No matter how hard I tried to avoid it, my gaze was constantly drawn to its edge. From the kitchen window, I could see the treetops swaying gently in the wind, as if mocking me. And sometimes, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a figure standing at the edge, watching. One afternoon, as I was preparing dinner, I glanced out the window and froze. There, at the forest's edge, was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He was tall, unnaturally thin, and his skin was pale, almost greenish. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as though he were studying me. I blinked, and he was gone. I rushed to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest looked normal again, its trees swaying gently in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The figure began appearing more frequently. Sometimes I saw him in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees. Other times, I would catch a glimpse of him reflected in the glass of a window or a mirror, only for him to vanish the moment I turned around. The worst part was that no one else saw him. I tried pointing him out to my husband one evening, but when he looked, there was nothing there. "You're just stressed," he said, wrapping an arm around me. "You need to stop thinking about the forest." But how could I stop thinking about it when it was all I could see? The whispers grew louder. They no longer waited for night to fall. They followed me throughout the day, seeping into every quiet moment. The voice was insistent now, its words sharper, more commanding. "Come back. You belong to us." I tried to ignore it, but my body betrayed me. My hands trembled constantly, making it difficult to do even the simplest tasks. My skin grew pale and cold, no matter how many layers I wore. And then there was the mark. It appeared one morning as I was brushing my hair. At first, I thought it was a bruise, a dark, greenish stain just above my collarbone. But as I stared at it in the mirror, I realized it wasn't a bruise at all. The shape was too precise, too deliberate. It looked like the outline of a hand, its long, thin fingers curling around my neck. I scrubbed at it with soap and water, but the mark wouldn't fade. It seemed to grow darker with each passing day, as if the forest itself was claiming me. By this point, I was barely sleeping. The whispers had turned into full-fledged voices, a chorus of low, guttural sounds that filled my mind whenever I closed my eyes. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to return to the forest, to the swamp, to him. One night, I couldn't resist any longer. The pull of the forest was too strong, the voices too loud to ignore. I slipped out of bed and left the apartment, my feet carrying me toward the tree-line as though they had a will of their own. The forest was different at night. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching impossibly far across the ground. The air was thick and cold, and the faint smell of decay hung in the breeze. As I walked, the whispers grew louder, guiding me deeper into the woods. The path beneath my feet twisted and turned, but I didn't falter. I knew where it was leading me, the swamp. When I reached it, the figure was waiting for me, standing in the reeds just as he had before. His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, and his long, greenish arms reached out toward me. "You came back," the voice rasped, echoing in my mind. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my legs trembling as the figure moved closer. His presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe. "You belong to us now," the voice said. "You stepped into our world. And now, you will never leave." The figure reached out, his long fingers brushing against my skin. The mark on my neck burned like fire, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The world around me blurred, the trees spinning and twisting into impossible shapes. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I looked in the mirror, the mark on my neck was still there, darker than ever. And deep in my heart, I knew the truth. The forest hadn't let me go. It never would. From that moment on, I never stepped foot in the forest again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers calling to me. And I know that one day, they'll come for me. After that night, I tried everything to block out the forest, to shut out its whispers and sever its hold over me. I rearranged the furniture in the apartment so I wouldn't have to look out the windows that faced the woods. I hung heavy curtains in the kitchen, hoping they would block the sight and the sensation of the forest watching me. I filled my days with noise, TV, music, anything to drown out the whispers. But it didn't work. The forest had moved closer. At first, it was subtle. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves clung to the air in my apartment, even with the windows shut tight. Then there were the shadows. They started appearing not just in the corners of rooms, but in places they shouldn't be, stretching along the walls, bending unnaturally, flickering like they belonged to trees that weren't there. The sounds came next, soft rustles in the hallway at night, the distant snap of twigs, the faint but unmistakable creak of old wood groaning under pressure. And then I noticed the leaves. One morning, as I stepped out of my apartment to take the baby for a walk, I froze. The hallway, once clean and ordinary, had become littered with dead leaves. Brown and brittle, they were scattered across the floor in front of my door, as if the forest itself was reaching for me. My breath hitched as I noticed a faint trail of dirt leading toward the elevator, like something had walked through with muddy feet. I bent down to pick up one of the leaves, but the moment my fingers brushed it, I felt a sharp, burning sensation on my skin. I pulled my hand back and stared at the red welt that was already forming on my palm, in the exact shape of a long, spindly handprint. The forest wasn't just calling me back, it was coming to me,